Hi, greetings, and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, a good government watchdog group that works for a government that serves all the people, elected through fair, secure, and accessible elections. We're a founding member of the Let New York Vote Coalition, a nonpartisan statewide coalition of grassroots networks, civil rights and civil liberties organizations, reentry communities, good government groups, unions, social service providers, immigrant rights groups, and everyday citizens, fighting to improve our elections by making registering and voting more accessible and equitable for every eligible New Yorker. Today, we'll be talking about the federal John Lewis Civil Rights Advancement Act and its state level companion, the New York State John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I'm very pleased to be joined today by two Let New York Vote Coalition partners, Lurie Daniel Favors, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, and Jawanza James Williams, Director of Organizing at Vocal New York. Thanks, Lurie and Jawanza, for joining me today. And before we dive into the topic, I'd like to give each one of you just a moment to let our audience know about your organizations and what you do.
Thank you so much, Susan. It really is a pleasure to be back here with you, particularly to talk about something as important as the Voting Rights Act. This is a really important act for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. As you know, we are a 35-year-old racial justice law center, the only racial justice law center that focuses on racial justice issues by providing quality legal advocacy, community education campaigns, facilitating research, and building organizing capacity on behalf of New Yorkers of African descent and the enfranchised. And we envision a politically sophisticated Black electorate and do the work of ensuring that we are providing the tools and resources necessary to both empower our constituents and to advocate and fight for them in the realm of voting rights, civil rights, and the pursuit of racial justice and the upholding of cultural rights. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you to have this conversation today.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure that the center is one of the members of the Let New York Vote Steering Committee.
That's right.
So, Jawanza, let people know what Vocal New York does, because it's really an interesting, important organization as well.
Sure. First, I have to say I'm really honored to be here. And I think it's such a critical time in the American experiment with democracy for us to really lean into public access media where people's voices from the grassroots are heard. You know, I often hear Amy Goodman say, we need to go to where the silence is because that's where the suffering is. And Dr. Cornel West, one of my heroes, also, really understands that. And Vocal New York, to be clear, is a statewide grassroots membership organization building power to end AIDS, homelessness, mass incarceration, and the drug war. We have chapters in Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany, Westchester County, and of course, the 5 boroughs. And what I don't often say in the mission is that we also work to build an economy and a democracy that works for all of us. And the way we do our work is we organize 4 issue-based unions made up of people who are directly impacted by the issues that we work on. So as we work to build political power, we use that power to then respond to immediate concrete needs, but also long-term needs towards building out an egalitarian New York State by passing city and state laws and really transforming the narrative, like operating from a politic of love and compassion and advocating for policies that are rooted in justice and equity.
And one of our leading grassroots partners on the fight for democracy around the state. So, Lurie, I think we're going to need some background first on, let's start with the federal John Lewis Civil Rights Advancement Act and let people know actually what's in that act, because it is large and important.
It's large and important, and it's been made even more important in recent years because of a lot of retrenchment in the voting rights arena. We have gone from a time when in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was initially signed into law, providing an enormous amount of protections for non-white voters who had traditionally been intentionally excluded from participating in the franchise, to 2013, where the Supreme Court, in a very infamous decision, Shelby County v. Holder, decided that the Voting Rights Act had worked so well, who needs it? And they basically gutted one of the most important provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which was the preclearance provision, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then not too long ago, just a few months ago, there was a second Supreme Court case that really took I guess if the 2013 case was the right hook, then the case that we heard just a few months ago was the left hook. And so the Voting Rights Act has taken a real beating. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is designed to recognize that we are still living in a time where voting rights are absolutely vitally necessary, and that we're living in a time when the efforts to suppress our access to the ballot have increased exponentially. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a phenomenal piece of legislation, it restores that most important element of the Voting Rights Act, the preclearance provision that the 2013 case really took the hammer to. It restores what's called preclearance. Preclearance is this concept that says if you have a history of being a bad actor, you have a history in your jurisdiction of preventing different minority groups from voting, if you have a history of making it more difficult for people of color to vote, well, then we should factor that history into our evaluation of current voting efforts and voting changes that you are making to the way that your constituents are able to access the ballot. So if you were one of those jurisdictions that had this history of being a bad actor, you had to go through preclearance. If there were any changes you were going to make to your voting rights or your electoral systems, those changes would have to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. Or before a federal court. And this was a really, really important. And one of the things people don't realize is that we often think about the Voting Rights Act as covering only Southern states or states that had a really expansive history of slavery. And even though New York did have an expansive history of slavery, because it's in the North, we often forget that there were portions of New York State that were also covered by the Voting Rights Act. And I'm not talking rural New York, I'm talking New York City, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, right? These are places that were also just quite frankly, run roughshod with voter suppression and inequitable access to the ballot. And so the Voting Rights Act preclearance provisions were extended to include parts of New York as well. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act recognizes that we are still in a time where there are communities that are not allowing all of their eligible voters to access the ballot appropriately or equitably. And so this new legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would restore that preclearance provision. And it provides a new formula, an updated formula that determines which jurisdictions would be covered, and it provides specific lengths of time. And if you are a jurisdiction that had a history of being a bad actor, but you get your act together and you're able to say, hey, we are going to reprioritize and recenter the importance of voting rights, then you might be able to come out from under preclearance. But the reality is we're still seeing a vital need, especially considering the fact that over the course of the past year, we have seen hundreds of voter suppression bills introduced in states all across the nation. For the sake of time, I'll just speed through some of the other provisions, but the Voting Rights Advancement Act also would allow for protections against vote dilution and vote denial. Under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, voters are allowed to sue if they need to block laws or practices that are intentionally discriminatory or which would lead results that were discriminatory. That effort under Section 2, if you think of preclearance as the shield and Section 2 as the sword or vice versa, that this vote dilution and vote denial, these provisions that were the remaining provisions that a number of voting rights activists were able to use, they were the ones that really came under, took a real beating in that case I mentioned in the Bronovich decision, where the Supreme Court just a few months ago made it even that much more difficult to win under vote dilution or vote denial cases. And the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would allow for that tool to be used once again. We also, there is a particular provision that includes the Native American Voting Rights Act, which also protects the right of Native Americans, of indigenous peoples, to vote in the face of barriers that they have experienced that are particular to their experience in tribal communities. And for time's sake, we can't go into all of these provisions, but just know that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act really was constructed in such a way that it would grapple with the issues that we are experiencing today, the voter suppression efforts that we're experiencing right now, and allows a pathway for us to really restore the power and restore the vote and access to the vote in a far more equitable way for those communities for whom it has traditionally been withheld.
Well, thank you for that extraordinary summary. Jawanza, you've been a passionate advocate. I've had the pleasure of working with you on rallies and vigils and teach-in webinars about the John Lewis Civil Rights Advancement Act over the last several months. Why is this act important to the people that you represent in your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much about what we're hearing about the details of the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill is really responding to really the bigger question, this bigger issue about what is democracy in the United States. Like, I oftentimes have to remind folks whenever they say to me, oh, well, we don't live in a democracy. I'm like, well, actually, democracy is an idea, and we're building institutions and vehicles are ways for us to be able to attempt to achieve that. American democracy is an experiment. It's an ongoing collective project. And our ability to vote, our ability to engage in that democratic process that we should be collectively building depends heavily on our ability to vote. So number one, that's, I think, especially for Black Americans and Brown Americans, Native Americans, like this question about like, well, who is allowed to vote in this country? Who has a say? Who has power in our democracy is wrapped up all within the complicated, the complex, the multidimensional realities of white supremacy, of colonialism, of imperialism, of the generation of anti-Black tropes, the therefore generation of cultures that maintain these problematic ideologies like white supremacy, like the dishumanity, the dehumanization of Black people, or people of African descent, I should say. And it produces a culture of violence. And that culture of violence produces the kinds of conditions that we find ourselves in today, where we can have state legislatures across the country pushing this narrative and these bills, these very tangible material attempts to diminish our ability to participate in democracy, which means our ability to influence how we're governed ultimately. And for an organization like Vocal New York, that becomes incredibly important, because if our mission is to end the AIDS epidemic in New York State, if it's to end mass incarceration, if it's to end the racist, classist drug war and its consequences, the hepatitis C crisis and the overdose crisis that is affecting millions of people across the country of all colors, of all political affiliations, et cetera, we cannot begin to lobby. We cannot begin to craft the kind of public policy that, that actually responds to the realities of our experiences, of our membership's experience, if we don't have a sound democratic means of engagement. And so nothing that we say, none of our evidence-based solutions to real problems mean anything if we can't act on those solutions, and we can't do that without democracy.
But we had a setback recently, right after Martin Luther King Day in the US Senate. Can you talk about what happened there?
You know, actually, and I'm sure you could give me some more details, but I do want to uplift a direct action that Vocal New York leaders took part in as a part of a national day of action. You know, we're also members of the People's Action Institute, a national network of progressive organizations across the country, working on a number of issues, but also working to secure, expand, and strengthen our democratic processes, like through the vote, for instance, as one piece. But, you know, the senator from Arizona, Kyrsten Sinema, and the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, these two folks have done so much work to destroy any possibility, it seems, thus far, for us to be able to govern ourselves, for us to find consensus in this Congress to protect the most quintessential part of this country's institutions. And so we have to be able, as Americans, as people that live in this country, regardless of how you identify politically, to be able to hold the complexities and the nuances of how our government and how we're being governed is being influenced. So what we did was that we learned that Goldman Sachs is this massive contributor, financing the campaigns of Kyrsten Sinema, of Senator Sinema, and Senator Manchin. So our leaders, because we're in New York City and we're so close to the behemoth of a beast that I would call American capitalism, we organized a direct action where we went to the headquarters of the Goldman Sachs office in Manhattan, and we had two giant documents There were people's cease and desist to Goldman Sachs, ordering them to immediately stop all contributions, political contributions to Senators Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, and really all senators and all representatives of our governments, and to immediately stop all influence, pushing back against the Build Back Better plan, pushing back against the kind of legislation that will actually make a difference. And it's a bit of political theater because it's not, but it is the people's demand.
And it's the leading tip of a movement to hold corporate donors responsible when they support anti-democratic electors and representatives. Thank you so much, because I think that's such an important action, and these actions are essential for people to see what's really at stake and who's being affected and who's the primary actors to continue weakening rather than strengthening our democracy. But Lurie, given the fact that we've been frustrated at the federal level, we're not giving up. For sure, the bill has to pass, the civil rights legislation has to pass, but we do have a response here in New York that I'd like to have you talk about.
We absolutely do. And I want to just add my support for the work that Vocal New York is doing, because y'all about it. And it's important that we have those direct actions that really do remind our people what is happening. And, Jawanza mentioned the two Democratic senators, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who were joined by 50 Republican senators who basically said, voting rights, who needs it? And they have largely aligned themselves. I'm reminded of the words of Barbara Arnwine, who's just an amazing civil rights activist. And she has said that we forget that there are people on both sides of the aisle who, quite frankly, are still infatuated with a white supremacist vision of leadership. And that's what we saw happening after Martin Luther King's, the observation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday this year. They had an opportunity to vote to allow debate on this bill, on this legislation that Chuck Schumer, God bless him, tried a whole bunch of different maneuvers to get it through. Couldn't get it through because, again, there are those who, quite frankly, benefit from not having non-white people having access to the ballot. But here in the state of New York, we have some amazing things happening. Senator Zelnor Myrie, Assemblymember Latrice Walker, two leading elected officials who are sponsoring the John Lewis Voting Rights New York State Voting Rights Advancement Act, named after that amazing elder. And this is a state version of the federal bill that would recognize what is happening here in New York State, because, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are not immune from voter suppression efforts, and it would create what we call a democracy canon. It would have provisions within the New York State Voting Rights Act that would ensure that in any circumstance, whenever there is a question about whether or not the right to vote should be enshrined or should be expanded, that we have a judicial and legislative interpretation that says we believe in expanding access to the ballot, and that we prefer that ballots be counted whenever it is possible for them to be counted. This is not one of those things where we're trying to get illegal ballots counted. That's not a thing. This is about making sure that our democracy in this state is aimed at and is primed for counting ballots as valid when you are able to do so. The New York State Voting Rights Act provides a cause of action against voter dilution and vote suppression, which would provide a way more efficient and effective way of prosecuting cases where voters of minority communities are having their voting strength diluted. It would create a statewide database that would ensure that the data is available for election administration and voting rights enforcement. I mean, you guys know how difficult it is to get access to the data that tells us who is turning out, which communities are showing up at the polls, and not having access to that makes enforcing voting rights that much more difficult. There's a provision for language assistance. We have literally, I think New York is the most diverse state in terms of language capacity. And the fact of the matter is that our federal regime, even if it were fully in place right now, does not provide the level of language access that, quite frankly, would be sufficient for what the language diversity that we have here in New York. So the language assistance provisions would allow that there would be specific help, that information would be translated into the language of diverse communities, of non-English speaking communities, when two 2% or 4,000 members of your political subdivision, your municipality, speak languages other than English and speak English less than very well. The pre-clearance provision, yes, is back. The pre-clearance provision would exist it is a part of the New York State Voting Rights Act. This would shift the burden from voters to prove that particular voting or electoral administrative policies are harming the voters, and it shifts the burden to the boards of election. It requires them to show that their laws and practices pertaining to the election are not discriminatory and that they will not have a discriminatory effect. And by housing the power to enforce this pre-clearance provision with the New York State Attorney General, currently a seat occupied by the amazing Tish James, who is serving our state so very well, it ensures that the crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act would also have a place in the New York State version. It prevents voter intimidation. It provides for a payment of attorney's fees, which allows for people to be incentivized to actually prosecute these cases. You know, they're not cheap, Susan. I know you know that well. It costs money to prosecute voting rights cases. And so these are structures.
Which is why the Supreme Court shifted it to private parties.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So we are really excited that the number of assembly members in support of this bill is increasing. We still need more. You all should be calling your assembly members to ask them if they are in support of the New York State Voting Rights Act. You should be calling your state senators to ask them if they are in support and have signed on to the New York State Voting Rights Act, because we are in a time now. I hate to be a person who promotes states' rights in light of what we're dealing with, but it's a good thing we have a state option, considering at the federal level, voting rights are being scaled back, the likes of which we're literally going to be voting this year with fewer protections than our ancestors had when they were trying to vote in the 1940s and 50s.
Well, let's be honest, there are definitely some people out there, and undoubtedly some of them are listening to this program, who would say, I know you've said in the past, New York wasn't as good as it should have been, but hey, we're a blue state, we're progressive. Why would we need something this detailed to protect voting rights in New York? I'm sure, Jawanza and Lurie, that you have specific instances that would show people that this is needed in New York State.
So do you guys remember in, I think it was the 2016 election, when all 100,000 voters in Brooklyn were purged from the voting rolls? That can't happen if you had a pre-clearance.
You mean the instance we sued on at Common Cause New York?
That very one. That does not happen if we had a pre-clearance provision. We've got school districts in this state right now where the schools are attended by predominantly Black and brown students, but the school boards are run by non-Black and brown people. And they are able to run at-large elections that are structured in such a way that even if 100% of the Black and brown residents in that community were voting for school board members, they would always be outvoted by a portion of the white community. So we have discriminatory voting happening in New York State right now. We are not so blue that we are immune from voter suppression efforts.
Jawanza, how would passage of this bill at the state level affect your constituency and your members?
So the first thing I just want to add to what Lurie is saying is that, number one, I think it's so critical that New Yorkers, especially Black and brown New Yorkers, fundamentally understand that neoliberalism is not progressivism, and that just because people hold a capital D Democrat under their name does not mean that they are as invested and interested in the maintenance and the expansion of democracy. So we need to make sure that we're protecting our ability to control who governs this state. So number one, so we should not leave that to chance ever, regardless of party, because neoliberalism as an idea, and by that, I just want to be clear, I mean that there are many people in this country that maybe they believe that some issues need to be reformed a bit here and there, but they don't fundamentally believe that there needs to be radical transformation of how we're organizing the society. And for a Black person, for a lot of our membership at Vocal New York, there are some significant structural problems that have to be 100% transformed. And we have to hold and understand that, and we can't really begin to engage because our primary leverage of power is our ability to vote people in and out of office and to hold them accountable later. But I think it would help this organization in particular, because we want to see the expansion of voting rights across the board. We want to see people across New York State jails and prisons being able to cast their votes, because we understand that, like, oftentimes the politicians, when we bring, like, let's say, for instance, through our homelessness union, we bring New Yorkers that are experiencing homelessness to the seats of power to have conversation about here's how you, in homelessness, and I can tell you from experiential authority what policies need to happen. That politician oftentimes is not as afraid of the homeless New Yorker because they're not afraid that the homeless New Yorker is going to be able to organize a movement of voters to vote them out of power. And I think whenever we continue to expand our ability to engage in democracy, the number of people able to legitimately participate legally in democracy, we have a better chance of achieving our goals, because so much of what we're organizing around, so much of the legislation that we've been fighting for, sometimes for 10, 15 years, is evidence-based solutions. These are not just games. These are not political games. These are about people's lives, very real experiences. And honestly, I believe that we just need to build more power. And I think that our ability to participate in democracy helps facilitate that. And through the process, through the organizing, through running the issue-based campaign, for the passage of voting rights, we have the conversation about, well, why do we want to pass these voting rights? Why do we want to make sure that Black and brown people have secure access to their ability to vote? Because we're talking about the issues about improving the conditions of people's experiences and moving our state, our city, our culture towards egalitarianism. And then that's the unfolding process. That's the project. That's the work that we're doing together. That's really the social contract that we're engaged in. It's sometimes unsaid, but we have to hold that. We have to center that. And we got to understand that not everybody, regardless of party, is on our side or has that vision for the world.
And so having those controls in place would really protect against the people that you describe who don't really want an effective, open, democratic, small d democratic process, which is, I think, the goal that we all have, is a strong democracy that's accessible for everybody. Jawanza and Lurie, would you please let the viewers know how they can get more resources about your organization, about the fight for civil rights at the federal and local New York State level, websites, other places that they should go to stay informed and frankly, to get involved?
To learn more about Vocal New York, you can follow us on Twitter at Vocal New York spelled out, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jawanza, Jawanza.
And to learn more about CLSJ, visit clsj.org. You can follow us online at CLSJ_MEC for Medgar Evers College. And we have resources there. And please stay tuned for our Advocacy Academy spring version coming up later this spring, where we'll be taking everyday New Yorkers and empowering them with the tools they need to figure out how to organize around solutions that they determine to be important.
You can find out more about Common Cause New York at commoncause.org/NY. And you can sign up to phone bank into states around the country to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, speaking to voters to have them call their senators in Republican states across the country. And of course, you can find out more about Let New York Vote at letnewyorkvote.org. And the New York John Lewis Voting Rights Act is one of our coalition's priorities for this legislative session. So thanks for joining us. I am looking forward to continuing the fight with these wonderful advocates, and I hope some of the viewers will join us, because everybody needs to be in this fight for us to win and have the democracy that we all deserve. Thanks so much.